True control isn't found in the shouting of orders, but in the silence of the aftermath. You don't ask for loyalty, you build a world where the alternative is impossible. For 38 years, Min-Soo Park has lived within the walls of his mother's impossible world. But tonight, at the height of a billionaire's gala, designed to finalize his marriage to Han Suan, the silence is finally about to break. Madame Choi and Suan believe they have successfully erased the invisible maid, Zuri Kamara, through a calculated accident, but they've forgotten one thing. A man who has mastered the art of the kill knows exactly when the prey is still breathing. If you're ready to see a kingdom burn for the woman who changed everything, subscribe, like, and share this video right now. Turn on notifications so you don't miss a single second of the fallout. The scene is set within the marble halls of the Choi estate, a precision-engineered evening where the air is thick with the scent of expensive lilies and institutional weight. To the outside world, this is a celebration of two dynasties merging. To Min-Soo, it is a cage. As the Choi family lawyer prepares the documents that will link him to Han Suan forever, Suan sits with a smile that never reaches her eyes, confident that Zuri is a fading ghost in a coma at Seoul General. But as the Han patriarch raises a glass to their inevitable future, Min-Soo's body does something his mind hasn't allowed in decades. It reacts. His phone vibrates with a single encrypted ping. Day 61. Patient is conscious. While his mother believes she has calculated every variable of this arrangement, she is unaware that Min-Soo hasn't been mourning for 2 months. He has been hunting. He has the driver, he has the confession, and now he has the reason to walk out of the dark and into the light. The air in the private dining room at Club Elysian was heavy with the scent of lilies and cold ambition. It was a space designed for the quiet architecture of power, where the clicking of silver against porcelain sounded like the cocking of a weapon. Madame Choi sat with her spine a rigid line of dark silk and inherited arrogance, her pearls gleaming under the amber chandelier like tiny, trapped moons. To her right, the Han patriarch anchored the table, his face a map of calculated patience. They were not here to dine, they were here to bind two empires together, weaving a net of contracts and bloodlines that would ensure their dominance for another generation. The delay is uncharacteristic, the Han patriarch remarked, his voice a low gravel that didn't quite mask the edge of an insult. He gestured toward the center of the table, where one high-backed chair sat empty, a silent void in the middle of their precision-engineered evening. Madame Choi didn't flinch. She reached for her wine glass, her movements fluid and practiced. Min-Soo understands the weight of tonight, she replied, though a microscopic flicker in her jaw betrayed the rising tide of her irritation. A man of his position does not rush. He settles his affairs so that when he arrives, his focus is absolute. Han Suan sat beside her father, the lace of her gown white as a funeral shroud. She looked every bit the perfect bride, her expression a mask of serene compliance that hid a jagged, desperate victory. In her mind, the Zuri problem had been solved 61 days ago on a rain-slicked intersection. She had scrubbed the invisible maid from the record, or so she believed. To Suan, that empty chair wasn't a sign of defiance. It was a throne waiting for a king who had finally been broken into submission. Across the table, the Choi family lawyer cleared his throat, sliding a leather document case forward. The sound of the zipper was a harsh tear in the atmospheric silence. "The Choan arrangement is finalized," he murmured, laying out the papers that would legally tether Min-Soo to Suan. "It only requires the principal's signature to activate the merger." Director Huang nodded, his presence providing the institutional weight that made the contract feel like a divine decree. They all stared at the empty chair, waiting for the man who lived in the dark to step into the light and sign away his soul. They were so consumed by the arrangement that they failed to notice the subtle vibration of Madame Choi's own phone on the linen cloth, or the way the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to deepen. They were masters of the world, convinced that they had accounted for every variable, never realizing that 60 floors below, the world's most feared man had just received a message that made the billions represented on those papers look like ash. The chair remained empty, not because Min-Soo was late, but because he was already gone. The silence in room 402 had been a heavy, clinical thing for 61 days, a thick layer of dust that even the most expensive private nurses couldn't scrub away. It was a room defined by the rhythmic, mechanical sigh of the ventilator and the steady, haunting pulse of the heart monitor, a jagged green line that was the only proof Zuri Kamara was still inhabiting her body. For 2 months, the world's most feared man had sat in the chair by the window, his silhouette a permanent fixture against the Seoul skyline, waiting for a sound that wasn't made by a machine. But tonight, the chair was empty. Across the city, at the Choi estate, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the suffocating weight of institutional inevitability. Min-Soo stood at the edge of the gala, his black suit acting as armor against the predatory smiles of the Han family and the sharp, expectant gaze of his mother. Madame Choi moved through the room like a spider in silk, her every gesture a silent command for Min-Soo to accept the Choan arrangement, a marriage that would bury the memory of his maid under a mountain of stock options and political alliances. Han Suan approached him, her hand trailing over the sleeve of his jacket with a possessive familiarity. "It's time to let the ghost go, Min-Soo," she whispered, her voice like honey laced with arsenic. "A man of your stature shouldn't be defined by an unfortunate accident." Min-Soo didn't blink. He looked through her, his mind miles away in a sterile room where a single yellow tulip was wilting on a bedside table. His body was a statue of titanium and discipline, the absolute stillness that had made him a legend in the underworld. He felt the cold pressure of his mother's gaze, the legal documents waiting on the mahogany table in the library, and the crushing momentum of a life being decided for him. Then the world shifted. In room 402, the rhythm changed. The heart monitor skipped, a frantic beep, 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 breaking the 61-day lullaby. Zuri's fingers, pale and thin against the white sheets, twitched. A low, ragged gasp caught in her throat as her lungs fought the machine for the right to breathe on their own. And then slowly, as if lifting the weight of the entire world, her eyelids fluttered. In the middle of the gala, deep within the pocket of Min-Soo's tailored jacket, his phone let out a single, sharp vibration. It was a physical jolt that traveled through his entire frame. His pupils dilated, and for the first time in his life, the hunter froze. He didn't need to look at the screen to know what the encrypted ping meant. His heart, which had been a cold, dormant stone since the night of the crash, suddenly hammered against his ribs with a violence that made his breath hitch. He looked at Suan, then at his mother, and for the first time, he didn't see power. He saw obstacles. The arrangement was made, the pearls were tightened, and the trap was set. But the one thing they hadn't accounted for was Zuri Kamara deciding to come back. The silence that followed Min-Soo's declaration was not the peaceful kind. It was the pressurized quiet of a deep-sea trench just before the glass cracks. Madame Choi's hand, still clutching her vintage wineglass, didn't tremble, but the skin across her knuckles pulled white and translucent. Beside her, Han Suan's rehearsed smile remained frozen on her face like a porcelain mask that had begun to fracture. To them, the arrangement was a sacred architecture, a billion-dollar cage built to keep the Park lineage pure. To Min-Soo, looking at the empty chair where his soul was supposed to sit, it was merely a heap of expensive debris. "The contract is ready, Min-Soo," the Choi family lawyer whispered, his voice cracking the stillness as he slid the leather case forward. The heavy fountain pen sat atop the cream-colored parchment like a loaded weapon. "Your signature is all that remains of the transition." Min-Soo didn't look at the pen. He didn't look at the Han patriarch, whose face was darkening with the insult of the delay. Instead, he looked at his mother. 61 days, he said, the words low and vibrating with a frequency that made the crystal glassware hum. For 61 days, you waited for her to die so you could finalize this. You chose the flowers for this dinner while she was still fighting for air. Min-Soo, sit down, Madame Choi commanded, her voice a whip crack of cold authority. Do not let a temporary obsession dismantle 38 years of discipline. Zuri Kamara was a ghost when she entered this house, and she is a ghost now. Sign the papers. Suan reached out then, her fingers, manicured, cold, and smelling of lilies, brushing against the sleeve of his tailored jacket. It was a gesture of ownership, a soft shackle intended to pull him back into the fold of institutional weight. Min-Soo looked down at her hand, then back at the door. In his mind, he saw Zuri in that forest green robe, a single yellow tulip in a world of gray stone. He felt his body betraying the titanium walls he had spent a lifetime building. His heart, once a muscle of absolute stillness, was now a drumbeat of war. With a slow, deliberate motion, Min-Soo pulled his arm away from Suan's grasp. He didn't just move, he detached. He stepped back from the table, the heavy mahogany chair screeching against the marble floor. A violent, ugly sound in such a precise room. The arrangement is over, he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm. Keep the legacy. Keep the billions. I am going to the hospital. He turned his back on the most powerful families in Seoul without a second glance. As he pushed through the heavy oak doors of Club Elysian, the world's most feared man didn't feel the weight of the empire he was leaving behind. He only felt the desperate, lung-bursting need to reach room 402 before the shadows caught up to the woman who had finally taught him how to breathe. The air in Seoul General Hospital didn't smell like the expensive lilies at the gala. It smelled of ozone, floor wax, and the quiet, clinical hum of machines keeping the fragile alive. Min-Soo stood by the window of room 402, his silhouette a jagged tear against the city lights. He hadn't moved in an hour, his hand still resting on the doorframe as if he were physically anchoring Zuri to the world of the living. In the hallway, Min-Jun moved with the silent efficiency of a shadow. While the world saw a loyal assistant, Min-Jun was the architect of Min-Soo's security, a man who understood that a mafia war was rarely fought with heavy artillery. It was fought in the margins. He stood at the nurse's station, his eyes scanning the digital duty roster with a predator's focus. The architecture is wrong, Min-Jun whispered into his earpiece, his voice barely a breath. He had spent the last 20 minutes cross-referencing staff IDs with the encrypted payrolls of the Han and Choi families. He found the anomaly at 11:14 p.m., a rotation change that didn't exist on the official server. A young assistant doctor, a man whose medical license was as thin as the paper it was printed on, was moving toward the restricted wing. He wasn't carrying a chart or a stethoscope. His hand was buried deep in his lab coat pocket, gripping something small and high density. Min-Jun didn't intercept him yet. He needed to see the secondary measure in motion. Through the glass partition of the observation lounge, Min-Jun watched the intruder pause. The man's eyes weren't those of a healer. They were darting, frantic, the eyes of a person who had been bought and knew the price of failure. This wasn't just a hit. It was a cleanup operation. Madame Choi and Suan weren't content with a coma anymore. They needed a flatline. Min-Jun's fingers flew across his tablet, killing the CCTV feed to the main security desk and rerouting it to Min-Soo's private device. He watched the assistant doctor pull a single, clear vial from his pocket, potassium chloride, a natural cardiac arrest. It was a ghost's weapon. Sir, Min-Jun's voice crackled in Min-Soo's ear, cold and precise. The invisible war is over. They've sent a wolf in a white coat. He's 3 doors down from Zuri. He's carrying the secondary measure. Inside the room, Min-Soo didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply looked down at Zuri's hand, so small and brown against the white hospital sheets, and felt a cold, familiar stillness settle over his bones. His body, which had frozen in shock only hours ago, now relaxed into the lethal grace of a hunter. The business-first soul he had cultivated for 38 years finally withered away, replaced by a singular, terrifying purpose. He stepped away from the window and moved toward the door, waiting for the soft click of the handle that would signal the end of his mother's world. The hospital room was a sanctuary of rhythmic bleeps and the sterile scent of antiseptic. But the air suddenly shifted, growing heavy with a silent, premeditated rot. Amora had been Zuri's anchor for 61 days, but even the most loyal guard has a moment of fraying. When a nurse called from the hallway about a misplaced insurance form, Amora squeezed Zuri's limp hand one last time and stepped out, the heavy door clicking shut with a sound like a gavel. Seconds later, the door eased open again. It wasn't the confident stride of Min-Soo or the familiar bustle of the night shift. It was a soft, hesitant shuffle. The assistant doctor, a man whose medical coat seemed too large for a conscience so small, slipped into the room. His name tag identified him as Dr. Cho, but his eyes were those of a man who had already spent the silver pieces he'd been promised by Han Suan. He didn't look at Zuri's face. To look at her, to see the flutter of her dark lashes or the faint, beautiful curve of her jaw, would be to acknowledge her humanity. Instead, he focused on the IV line, the plastic umbilical cord keeping her tethered to the world of the living. From his pocket, he withdrew a glass syringe. It wasn't filled with the antibiotics she needed or the saline that kept her hydrated. It held a concentrated, lethal dose of potassium chloride, a chemical lightning bolt designed to stop a heart without leaving a footprint. The doctor's hands shook, the glass vial catching the moonlight that filtered through the hospital blinds. He knew the secondary measure was a point of no return. If Min-Soo Park's world was built on the art of the kill, Han Suan's was built on the art of the accident. This would look like a sudden, tragic cardiac arrest, a body too weak to sustain its own recovery. He leaned over the bed, the syringe hovering inches from the rubber port of the IV. Zuri lay there, her natural, minimal makeup replaced by the pale exhaustion of a long sleep, looking like the invisible ghost she had spent 7 months trying to be. The doctor's thumb pressed against the plunger, the first drop of the toxin beetling at the tip of the needle. In the hallway, the distant sound of Amora's laughter faded. The room fell into a vacuum of absolute predatory silence. He closed his eyes, bracing himself to plunge the liquid home, unaware that the titanium walls of the Park Empire were already crashing through the hospital's front gates, led by a man whose body would always move faster than a killer's hand. Min-Soo's shoes didn't click against the hospital linoleum. They struck it with the rhythmic, lethal precision of a countdown. Every instinct that had kept him alive in the dark corners of Seoul was screaming. He had spent a lifetime reading the subtle shifts in a room's temperature, the way a shadow leaned, or the uneven breath of a man holding a weapon. As he reached room 402, the air didn't just feel cold, it felt hollowed out, as if the oxygen was being sucked toward a vacuum. He didn't wait to turn the handle. He hit the door with the full weight of his shoulder, the sound of the latch snapping lost in the sudden, violent burst of his entry. Inside, the scene was bathed in the sickly, artificial glow of the emergency lights. The assistant doctor, a man whose name was already marked for deletion in Min-Soo's mind, stood over Zuri. His hands were trembling, but his intent was steady. The moonlight caught the curve of a glass syringe, the liquid inside clear and indifferent. The needle hadn't just touched her, it had begun to depress the soft, vulnerable skin of her inner arm, right above the IV line that was supposed to be her lifeline. In that fraction of a second, the titanium walls Min-Soo had built over 38 years didn't just crack, they evaporated. His mind, usually a fortress of cold calculation, went silent, replaced by a raw, primal roar. His body betrayed the absolute stillness he was famous for. He didn't think about the legal repercussions or the political fallout of a mafia boss attacking a medical professional in a public ward. He simply moved. He was a blur of dark wool and kinetic fury. Before the doctor could even register the intrusion, Min-Soo's hand closed around the man's wrist with the force of a hydraulic press. There was a sickening, wet snap as the bone gave way, and the syringe clattered to the floor, shattering into 1,000 jagged diamonds. Min-Soo didn't stop. He drove the man back against the heart monitor, his forearm pinned against the doctor's throat, cutting off the air before a scream could escape. The machines began to wail, a frantic electronic pulse that mirrored the chaos in Min-Soo's chest. "You chose the wrong room," Min-Soo hissed, his voice so low it was almost a vibration. He wasn't looking at the doctor. His eyes were locked on Zuri. Her chest was rising and falling in shallow, terrified hitches, her eyes wide and glassy as she processed the violence saving her life. For the first time, the world's most feared man didn't look away. He let her see the monster he was and the protector he had become, while his hand, the one not pinning a murderer to the wall, reached out to hover, trembling, just an inch above her pale, scarred hand. He had arrived, and the world would burn before he let anyone move him again. The air in the private consultation room didn't just feel cold, it felt pressurized, as if Min-Soo's presence had sucked the oxygen out of the small space. Dr. Lee, the assistant physician whose hands were still trembling from the discarded syringe, sat slumped in a plastic chair. He looked less like a doctor and more like a man watching his own funeral procession. Min-Soo didn't sit. He stood by the door, his silhouette cutting a jagged shadow against the sterile white tiles, his absolute stillness more terrifying than any outburst of rage. The compound in that needle would have stopped a heart in less than 40 seconds, Min-Soo said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that vibrated in the doctor's marrow. It leaves no trace in a standard toxicology report. It's a clean kill, a professional kill. He took a single step forward, the click of his Italian leather shoes sounding like a hammer cocking on a revolver. "Who gave you the vial, Lee? And don't tell me it was for the hospital. My mother's foundation doesn't donate poison." The doctor's breath hitched, a pathetic, wet sound. I have debts, Director Park. They said it was just a mercy, that she was already a ghost. They promised my family would be moved to Singapore. Min-Soo leaned down, his face inches from the doctor's, his wide, bulging eyes reflecting the man's terror. This was the mafia boss the board members feared, the man who could dismantle a soul with a single look. There is no Singapore. There is only me, and right now, I am the only thing standing between you and the deep, dark quiet of the Han River. He pulled a sleek, encrypted tablet from his jacket and slid it across the table. It showed a frozen frame of a black sedan, the same one that had hit Zuri 61 days ago. Was it the same hand? The same bank account? Lee's eyes darted to the screen, then back to Min-Soo's icy gaze. He broke. The words came out in a frantic, suffocating rush. It wasn't Madame Choi. Not directly. It was the Han girl, Suan. She called from a burner phone, but the transfer came through a shell company linked to her father's law firm. She said Zuri was an unfortunate chapter that needed to be closed before the engagement dinner. She told me if she didn't die tonight, I would. Min-Soo straightened up, his body finally relaxing into a terrifyingly calm posture. The frozen man from the doorway was gone, replaced by a predator who finally had the scent. He didn't roar, he simply adjusted his cuffs. You're going to write down every word of that, the account numbers, the times, the promises. He turned toward the door, where Min-Jun was already waiting with a recording device. And then, Doctor, you're going to pray that Zuri Kamara lives, because if her heart stops, I'll make sure yours becomes a very public example of what happens when someone touches what belongs to me. Min-Soo Park did not enter the ballroom of the Choi estate. He haunted it. The heavy oak doors swung open with a synchronized thud that cut through the refined hum of violin quartets and the clinking of crystal. He was a vision of controlled devastation, his black suit absorbing the glitter of the chandeliers until he looked like a shadow moving through a hall of mirrors. At the head of the room, Madame Choi froze, her champagne flute pausing midair. Beside her, Han Suan adjusted her pearls, her face a mask of practiced porcelain grace, though her eyes darted toward the empty space Min-Soo was supposed to have occupied hours ago. "You're late, Min-Soo," his mother said, her voice a silk thread of warning. "The documents are waiting. The Han patriarch has been most patient with your distractions." Min-Soo didn't speak. He walked past the rows of Seoul's elite, his footsteps the only sound in a room that had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. He reached the podium where the Choi family lawyer stood, ready to bridge two empires with a drop of ink. With a flick of his wrist, Min-Soo bypassed the leather document case and connected his phone to the house audio system, the same system meant for wedding toasts and corporate mergers. "I am not here to sign," Min-Soo said, his voice amplified, low and vibrating with a frequency that made the institutional weight of the room feel fragile. "I am here to settle a debt." He pressed a single button. The ballroom was instantly consumed by a jagged, low-quality recording. The voice of the assistant doctor filled the space, trembling and distorted. "I didn't want to do it. Madame Choi said the maid was a stain, but Han Suan was the one who provided the compound. She told me if the car didn't kill her, the needle had to." The silence that followed was not empty, it was pressurized. The Han patriarch turned to his daughter, his face reddening as the precision-engineered reputation of his bloodline dissolved in seconds. Suan's porcelain mask finally shattered, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps as the press, invited to witness a union, began the frantic flash of cameras. Min-Soo stepped toward his mother, leaning in until he was the only thing she could see. "You taught me that power arranges itself quietly," he whispered, loud enough for the nearest microphones to catch. "So listen to the sound of your world falling apart. It's the quietest thing I've ever built." He turned his back on the billions, the legacy, and the wreckage of his name. He didn't look back at the chaos or the ruined socialites. He had a woman waiting for him in room 402. And for the first time in 38 years, the world's most feared man was walking towards something that finally felt like home. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway hummed with a clinical indifference, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence inside room 402. Min-Soo had stepped out to coordinate the final legal dismantling of the Han family, leaving Zuri in the fragile peace of her recovery. But the peace was an illusion. The vibration of a phone against the metal nightstand sounded like a localized earthquake. Zuri reached out, her fingers still trembling from the week's trauma, to find an unknown number lighting up the screen. There was no greeting, only a series of high-resolution images that began to download with agonizing slowness. The first was a grainy surveillance shot from 5 years ago in Boson. It wasn't the Min-Soo she knew, the man who brought her yellow tulips and watched her breathe while she slept. This man was a shadow wrapped in a charcoal overcoat, standing over a kneeling figure in a rain-slicked alley. His expression was a void of absolute, terrifying stillness. The next image was a digital scan of a ledger, the Boson arrangement, detailing a list of names that had simply ceased to exist to ensure the Park Empire's ascension. Then a voice memo arrived. Han Suan's voice was like crushed velvet, smooth and poisonous. "Do you truly think a predator changes his nature because he found a pretty bird to cage?" the recording hissed. "He didn't save you because he loves you, Zuri. He saved you because he owns you. In Boson, he cleared the streets of anyone who looked at him wrong. How long until your invisible status becomes a liability he decides to liquidate? You are living in a graveyard he built, sleeping on sheets he bought with blood, Ask him about the boy in the alley. Ask him if his body betrayed him then too. Zuri felt the air leave her lungs. The bosun's secret wasn't just a revelation of violence. It was a psychological scalpel designed to sever the only thing Min-Soo couldn't buy, her trust. She stared at the man in the photo, the world's most feared mafia boss, and tried to find the soul she thought she had touched. The door handle turned. Min-Soo walked in, his silhouette framed by the harsh corridor light. He froze, his gaze dropping to the phone in her hand, then to the tears tracked through the hospital paleness of her cheeks. He didn't move to take the phone. He didn't offer a lie. The titanium walls he had spent a lifetime building seemed to vibrate with the weight of the truth. Suan sent it, Zuri whispered, her voice breaking. Is this the man I'm supposed to love? Or is this the man I'm supposed to fear? Min-Soo stood in the center of the room, stripped of his institutional weight, looking at the woman who had become his only mirror. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of power. It was the silence of a man waiting to see if his past had finally succeeded in murdering his future. 3 months after the glass had shattered at the gala, the penthouse was filled not with the scent of expensive lilies, but with the quiet, grounding aroma of rain and old books. Zuri sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, the city of Seoul sprawling beneath her like a map of a life she no longer had to fear. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wore a soft, oversized sweater that belonged to the man currently standing in the doorway, his silhouette no longer a threat, but an anchor. Min-Soo didn't move. He remained in that threshold, a habit of a man who spent 38 years expecting a door to slam in his face. In his hand, he held a single, yellow tulip, its petals bright against his dark suit. He looked at her with the wide, vulnerable eyes of the man who had frozen months ago. But the shock had been replaced by a terrifyingly honest devotion. He walked toward her, setting the flower on the small ceramic table between them, a table that now held 2 cups of tea instead of his solitary glass of scotch. Suan was right about one thing, Min-Soo said, his voice stripped of its mafia boss gravel, leaving only the raw truth of the man underneath. I am a man of dark rooms and blood-stained ledgers. My past isn't a chapter you can just skip. It's the ink this entire book is written in. He looked down at his hands, hands that had dismantled empires and broken men. If you walk away now, I have ensured you will never want for anything. The bosun arrangement is dead. You are free, Zuri. Truly free. Zuri looked at the tulip, then up at the man who had burned his own kingdom to keep her breathing. She saw the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his fingers, the scars that Han Suan thought would drive her away. Suan had played her final card, believing that exposing Min-Soo's brutality would make Zuri run. But Suan didn't understand that Zuri hadn't fallen in love with a billionaire or a boss. She had fallen in love with a man who sat through 61 nights in a plastic hospital chair, counting her heartbeats. Zuri stood up, closing the distance between them. She didn't reach for his power or his protection. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. I didn't choose the man who owns this city, Min-Soo, she whispered, her voice a steady flame in the quiet room. I chose the man who chose me when I was invisible. I'm not staying for the palace. I'm staying for the scars, because they are the only part of you that's real. The world's most feared man finally let go of his breath, leaning his forehead against hers. In the ordinary light of a shared morning, they were no longer master and maid, or hunter and prey. They were simply 2 people who had decided that love was worth every single price it asked. Some things do not announce themselves, they simply stay. In the end, Min-Soo Park learned that the most dangerous thing isn't an enemy's bullet. It's a heart that finally refuses to stay small. He walked into that room a boss, but he stayed because he finally became a man. True power isn't about what you can take. It's about what you're willing to lose to keep the person who makes you feel alive. If this story hit you in the heart, drop "worth every price" in the comments below and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Remember to subscribe to Mafia Boss Love Stories TV, like and share this video to support Zuri's journey, and turn on notifications for our next epic tale. We love you, besties. See you in the next story.